Defeat Putin. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
We came, we saw, he died.
We both agree that Assad needs to go.
You know, fuck the EU.
Yeah. And yeah, we are live. And of course, I have forgotten to bring Boja to the scene. And I have. And here we are. Here is Neboja, but I still have some echoing in my ear, so I have to understand where is this coming from.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly. Yes. Okay, I think I found it. It was on Instagram. How are you doing, Neboja?
Doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm fine. Thank you again for coming to answering the call. So today we've been planning this for quite a while now. This is a prelude to World War. And the intention of this program is to analyze the not, military porn or stuff like that of World War, but the scenario where the world was seeing at the moments before World War One, before World War Two, if we had time, and to compare the similarities and the difference between the moment we are living now. One thing that called my attention during this time, and I had I don't know if you watch this. I had Dragana Trifkovic here last week, and several people, including yourself, that been here during this time. I've been seeing a lot of small flags that show that it looks a lot like the West is looking a lot like the collapse of Soviet Union, and we see that we made two shows, actually almost three, talking about another damn stupid thing in the Balkans. That was a famous phrase from the German
Bismarck.
guy. What's his name? Bismarck. It's at least is a tribute to him. And again, we are seeing an economic problem in Europe. We are seeing divisions in Europe. We are seeing the economic hegemony of the West, or the United States, to be more clear, going down the tubes. And in the other side, we have, Russia blooming, China blooming, Iran becoming a major regional power. We just saw today, yesterday in the case, an attempted coup in Bolivia. And so we are seeing a lot of small things going around. I mean, the West Africa, let's not forget the West Africa coups and all that. So we are seeing a lot of things going around. And I would like to understand, I'm not a historian, you're a historian. I would like to understand the prelude to war. Because as you mentioned perfectly, this week on the 22nd, it was the 22nd, it was the anniversary of the invasion of Soviet Union by Germany. And many people get these dates as the beginning of the war. Historians usually put these dates or specific events as the beginning of the war. But if we look behind, 10 years behind, we can see that the war has started long ago. And yeah, there's this big trigger, like, Franz Ferdinand from your city, and then this. So let's start with World War One. Yeah, we had just mentioned Franz Ferdinand assassination by a Serbian, right?
Mm-hmm.
In
Sarajevo.
In Sarajevo, in Bosnia, exactly, which is also a city that not long ago was on the news because of the war.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go there. Before that, how was the climate on Europe just before that trigger happened?
So basically, to understand, people focus on World War II a lot because, as I believe Tucker Carlson said, it's always 1938 in Munich for certain Western diplomats. What they don't understand about 1938 in Munich is that the desire to avoid another European and therefore global war was deeply rooted in events from 20 years before. World War I, because it was the most destructive war since the 1600s. There was this massive war in Europe in the 1600s called the 30 Years' War. It started as a dispute between like Czechians and Austrians over who's going to run the Holy Roman Empire, and it just sort of degenerated into this religious war, ethnic war, general plunder of everybody against everybody, and was just massive carnage for 30 years with most of Central Europe getting depopulated. And it was so devastating that everybody after, when they made peace, were like, let's just set up a system that's going to resolve these disputes, hopefully forever, so that we never have to deal with this again. And for almost 400 years, it worked. The Westphalian system that more or less still exists is the product of this, named after the peace treaty that ended it. So you go back to like the 19th century, the long peace after Napoleonic Wars, and you have this order set up by the reactionary powers that defeated Napoleon, the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, the British, which sought to stabilize things and sort of restore status quo ante-Napoleon, but they couldn't do it. And when they tried to push back on these nationalist revolutions in 1848, they failed. The Russians waltzed in and crushed the Hungarian revolt, and it didn't do anything. And the Austrians were like, yeah, go away. We don't like you. So they were sort of taken aback at that. And then in 1853, you've got the Crimean War with the British and the French conspiring to help the Turks because they were afraid of Russia, naturally advancing to the Balkans. And in 1860s, you've got first you have the Italian War of Unification in the 1850s. Then you have the Prussian Wars with Austria and Denmark in the 1860s, culminating in 1871 when Germany basically unites after defeating France. So this myth about the long peace, it wasn't really a long peace, but compared to Napoleonic Wars, all of these wars were relatively swift and decisive. And then you get to the 1876 rebellions in the Balkans and the Russo-Turkish War, where the Russians get involved fairly late, end up in a sort of a stalemate for a year or two, break through in present-day Bulgaria, smash the Ottoman armies, end up at the gates of what was then called Constantinople, and still is by some people, and having the Ottomans sign basically a capitulation, at which point the British and the Austrians and the Germans and everybody else slides in and says, no, not so fast. We have to get involved here because we're the international community. And I'm setting the stage here because this is 1878, Congress of Berlin, and this is when they partitioned the Balkans so that, the Russian gains are rolled back and everybody else gets their piece of, pound of flesh, even though they weren't involved, even though they were protecting the Ottomans. They don't really care what happens to the Ottomans. The Ottomans sort of get shafted either way. But basically, the Austrians occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina, which were two provinces, and as well as this other territory in between Serbia and Montenegro. Bulgaria doesn't quite get its independence. Romania doesn't quite get the lands it needed and wanted. And Greece doesn't get what it needed. And so they sort of set up the stage for not just another confrontation between the Balkan countries, which officially got recognized as like, oh, well, Serbia, we're officially recognizing you as an independent country. Thank you. We've been one for de facto for 40 years. Where's our land? But they
if I may just make an interruption here, I was searching for at some point in my life, I don't know why, I was searching for the ancient written language, the oldest written language, and one of the things that came in my direction was Serbian first written, some stars and symbols, basically, not as we know today.
Right. So there was an ancient culture actually down the river from Belgrade in a place called Vinča that is one of those mysterious ancient civilizations. It's really old. It did have its own system of writing. People have lived here for millennia. And we're still sort of figuring out, whether these people are genetically related to the present inhabitants, because modern historiography insists that the Slavs moved here from someplace else in like the 7th century. But there's no accounting who lived here between the end of the Roman Empire or during the Roman Empire and then. And so there's this whole modern theory that, the people of Vinča just kept living here because they didn't move. And that, the Romans knew them as Illyrians, the Greeks knew them as something else, the Huns and the Avars who moved in later encountered them and intermixed. And I mean, you've got all these genetic studies now that you can do to help
to
you
sell
pinpoint
it to the Pentagon, of course.
Right. Well, yeah, you don't want to do that. They're collecting DNA for other purposes. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those fascinating. I actually still have to go to Vinča. I've been here for about 6 months now, and it's on my list of things on my list of places to visit and take a look at it. It's fascinating from what I've heard. So anyway, fast forward to the 1870s, and you've got this Congress of Berlin that Bismarck has called. Mm-hmm. And he's trying to mediate these things, and he doesn't succeed. He's not happy because he realizes, and this is where the quote comes from, the Balkans aren't worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier, is what he said at the time, Pomerania being the heartland of Prussia. And also, if there is another war, it will be over some damn stupid thing in the Balkans, because he was getting increasingly frustrated with the Austrians who were pushing for hegemony there. Ironically, because he helped push them out of Italy and Central Europe, but whatever. And so you have a situation where nobody's happy. Literally nobody's happy, except perhaps the British. And that sets the stage for the heart of the dispute that ended up boiling over 40 years later into World War I, which is Bosnia and Herzegovina. These two territories were at the time majority Serbian ethnically. And that's even without counting the ethnic Serbs who converted to Islam and considered themselves something else, but spoke the language. This is a phenomenon of Balkans Muslims, is that they didn't speak Arabic or Turkish. They spoke the language of the people where they came from, or it was Bulgarian or Serbian or whatever. But they considered themselves distinct because of their faith. Mm-hmm. So when Serbia freed itself from the Ottoman yoke in the early 1800s, which I believe it was the first Balkans principality to do so, a lot of the converts, the Serbs who converted to Islam, picked up and left with the Ottomans because they didn't want to live on equal footing with the Christians. They were supposed to be the master race, and, well, they weren't on top anymore, and so they left. Bosnia at this point was still ruled by the Ottoman Empire. The Austrians come in and they basically preserve the Ottoman stratification in the system. They just replace the Sultan with themselves. They build breweries, they build railways to extract mineral wealth. They build. You look at the map of Austrian infrastructure projects, and you realize that it wasn't intended to connect Bosnia to. It wasn't intended to help people in Bosnia and Herzegovina move around. It was designed for Austrians to extract wealth. It was a colony. It was a crown colony for 30 years. And in 1908, there's all of these cultural movements. The Serbs are trying to, preserve their culture and their religion and their identity. And you have this very strong movement inside the Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary at that point, that is basically trying to obliterate all of the other identities except for German and Hungarian, even though I believe more than a third of the empire were actually Slavs of some kind, Czechs, Slovaks, and present-day Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, but they were trying to suppress them, and basically everything was either German or Hungarian. And if you're not one of those groups, you learn their languages and shut up. And, well, I mean, the Czechs didn't take too kindly to this, and of course the Serbs, but you have a situation in which there's tremendous also pressure because of the Catholic Church, because both the German-speaking Austrians and Hungarians are Catholic, whereas the Serbs are not. 90% of them are Orthodox, if not more. And so there's a tremendous pressure by the Catholic Church to force them into the union, such as some of the Ukrainians, present-day Ukrainians, were in the Eastern Rite Catholics. They were using Orthodox rituals, but swore loyalty to Rome, which is sort of a step towards becoming fully Catholic. And so this is going on for centuries because, like in the 1700s, the Austrians were trying to do this to the Serbs that they settled around the Ottoman borders, around the borders of present-day Bosnia. Anyway,
since we got an anyway, let me interrupt here for a second. I just kind of see 3 points. Well, first of all, you just mentioned the religious war, the Orthodox against Catholics, which I'm not seen as a great at this moment, but we see a great religious a big religious division in the planet right now, and this is something that I don't hear for the last 30 years of my life, I would say. There's always some things, but not in these things in this manner that people are speaking now. Zionists, and you have the Muslim world, and we have just the other day we were supposed to have a program about that. I end up talking about it a little bit with Dragana Trifkovic, which was the thing in the UN about the Bosnian genocide. I cannot say the G word, which seems to be something designed to split the world again between Muslims and non-Muslims. And so, as you were just mentioning, the Muslim part of Bosnia and all that. The other thing that I understand was that, as you mentioned, there was some push out of Austria from some of its from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from its zone of influence. And then let me
recap that so that the audience will keep pace. So basically the Habsburgs traditionally ran the Holy Roman Empire, which was most of the German states in Central Europe. Napoleon sort of put a stake in that and killed it in the early 1800s. But the Austrian Empire persisted, and it had some influence, especially over more Catholic parts of Germany, like Bavaria and Saxony. And then when the Prussians came to be the dominant force, and the Prussians were traditionally Protestants ever since those events in the 1600s, so they kept they sort of papered over the religious divides in the greater Germany, but they pushed Austrians out of German politics and sort of put them in their own reservation. Had Austria been any weaker, it probably would have been integrated into Germany, but Bismarck didn't want any rivals. And so you have this German-speaking community left out of Greater Germany because of Austrian Empire. The Habsburg Empire.
Just as a trivia, the yellow on the Brazilian flag, the yellow part is from the Habsburg family.
Because they were all over the place. I want to say like Philip V or Charles IV. I keep mixing them up. They controlled like half the world nominally, because they ruled Spain at one point, and they most of Italy. They had holdings in northern Italy, like the entire northern Italy was ruled by Austria at one point in time. I think Milan was a major Habsburg stronghold. So there was this whole. I mean, I have Italian in-laws, and the folks from the south usually say, "Oh, the people up north, they're Germans," because they have the German mentality from centuries of being under Austria. But yeah, by the time Italian unification happened, all of that was the Austrians were defeated and forced to evacuate. And so, when we get to 1878, Austria-Hungary is basically hemmed in on the Balkans, and their only expansion prospect is the newly freed Balkans, principalities, and states from the Ottoman Empire. Mm-hmm. And so they're focusing that way. Anyway, so you've got a situation, and let me pause here for a second and also mention the religious war parallel. Let's here's food for thought. I'm just going to leave it there for people to think about. You might think that in modern day there is no religious tension, but if you consider Western wokeism as a religion, and you realize how it's clashing with traditional religions, whether it's Islam, right? Whether it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism, and to which extent it pretends to be compatible with some of them and using some against the others, there is definitely a religious component to the present day conflict as well. So with that said, let's go back to 1908, set the table for what happens in 1914. Because again, you mentioned historians love dates because they take those as beginnings. They might be opening chapters of a book, but things have happened before that to set the stage. So, nothing happens overnight. It's a process. Human lives, societies, empires, it's a process. Rebecca West actually did a really good job of setting the stage for her book about the Balkans that was written pre-World War II. But Barbara Tuchman, who wrote The Guns of August, which is still a fantastic book about World War I, that unfairly neglects the Balkans theater, obviously, but it's still a fantastic book. She actually opens it in early 1900s at the funeral of the English king, Edward somethings. Don't quote me on it, which one it was, but it's basically the last supper, the sun setting on Imperial Europe, because that was the last gathering of kings all over the place. And within 10 years, they'll all be dead, or all of their empires are going to be destroyed, and nobody's going to be left standing. And that's a very powerful image. And it's like years before this. A lot of the revisionist historians from 10 years ago, when the centenary of the war happened, we're starting from 1903, which was the year that Serbia had a change of government, a very violent one. And they're saying, oh, well, this is what's set the stage for war. It wasn't. It was partly to blame, but it contributed to Austria's decision to go east that was already made. And so, again, bouncing a lot of back and forth. But let me go back to let's say 1903. Yeah, let's see 1903. Okay, so between 1878 and 1903, Serbia is ruled by the Obrenović dynasty, which was the one that managed to defeat the Turks the second time around. Its prince managed to make a secret deal with the Austrians to basically be their vassal, their client, obey whatever they tell him to do, from trade policy to foreign policy, and they will allow him to crown himself king. And his son was a pretty decent soldier, a lousy statesman, a bit of a Nepo baby, and he married a divorcee who was previously married to a merchant. Everybody thought it was beneath him. It was very controversial. He wasn't universally loved by the people, and he made things worse by basically appointing her relatives at key positions in the government, including in the military. There was already a clique of the officers who were not happy with the Obrenović family, which is ironic because they spent a lot of money on building up the military. And in May 1903, this group of officers decides to overthrow the king because the queen had lied about being pregnant. He had no heir. There was a huge scandal. This came out, and they just had it. They just had it with that family. They wanted them gone. And when they finally found the king and the queen hiding in a closet of the royal palace, they accidentally found them. I think one of them sneezed or yelled or something, and they found them hiding in a closet, dragged them out, shot them, cut them with swords, threw them out the window of the royal palace into the courtyard, and declared victory. And this was, of course, seen as horrifying in the rest of Europe, because all these royal houses that had been around for centuries were like, oh, you don't do that, you don't touch the sacred royal person. What they didn't realize is that, this royal family, as well as the other one, came from Serbian peasantry and were not, hung up on these niceties of European royalty. I have to say, as a Serb, it's a point of pride that our royal houses were not imported from Germany, just like everybody else's. The Greeks, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, they all had their royal families, they sent in from obscure German side houses because they didn't have any of their own. Whereas, we had our not just one homegrown dynasty, but two that kept fighting each other. Figures, right? So in 1903, the very, very old at that time grandson of Karađorđe, the first leader of the first rebellion, basically is invited to take on the crown by the coup leaders, the military. And he makes a deal with them. He's like, I don't like the way you did this, but, somebody's got to be king, and if you're offering it to me, I have conditions. And his reign is fondly remembered. Here's a time of law and order and prosperity and freedom, where a whole bunch of people from Europe settled in Serbia because they liked the way things looked and things ran. But almost immediately, the Austrians start a trade war. Think sanctions, just like in present day. And they basically say, oh, we had the secret deal. You're violating it. We're going to sanction you and make you unable to export anything. And the Serbs were like, fine, we'll just sell our stuff elsewhere. There's Romania, there's Bulgaria, there's the Russians. We're just going to turn to Russians now, and you can't do anything about it. And this totally backfired on the Austrians, the so-called pig war. Just absolutely removed all of their leverage from Serbian economy. If that sounds familiar, that's because it should. Hello, sanctions architects. And so the Austrians, the Austrians, having lost leverage, were like, well, what do we do? So they come up with this brilliant idea of annexing Bosnia officially. Like, up until that point, they were pretending they were stewards of it for the Ottoman Empire. In 1908, they're like, you know what? This is a crown colony. We've built bridges and factories and railways and stuff. We're just going to make it part of Austria-Hungary as, direct Austrian crown lands, not part of Hungary, as it was supposed to be under the 1867 agreement. No, we're just going to make it an Austrian crown colony and, make all of these people Austrian subjects. So decreed. And the Serbs were like, no, these are our lands. This is our people living there. This is supposed to be part of Serbia at some point when we chase you guys out. We're fixing for war. Well, Russia is in no position to fight a war because they just fought a short victorious war with Japan that was neither of those things. And they had a revolution that almost succeeded. They were in big trouble. They needed a decade of peace to get their stuff together. And so the Russian emperor is like, no. Stand down. Please stand down. Whatever you're doing, just stand down. I'll owe you one. Please just don't fight a war. And the Austrians like, yeah, you can't do anything about this. You're not going to do anything about this in the future. We can just do whatever we want. And the Germans at this point, because Bismarck has died and Wilhelm has taken over foreign policy and appointed just a series of inept prime ministers, foreign ministers, and chancellors, it's like, you know what? I think it's the right time to make an agreement, make a pact with Austria because they seem to be like the up-and-coming people here. And the ghost of Bismarck is going, no, you idiot. And the British and the French are overcoming their, centuries of enmity going, wait a second, we got to do something about these Germans. And they're opening an overture to Russia because they think Russia's sufficiently weak now that they can dictate terms. And so you have these outlines of these alliances starting to form because the Austrians have decided to be stupid and violate the terms of the Congress of Berlin after 30 years. And at this point, something's going to happen. You've got the Moroccan crisis. You've got all these other, the Sudan. There's tensions in between these empires everywhere, constantly. But because they're taking place in Africa, and you send a couple of gunships and you send an expeditionary force, nobody thinks twice about it. But the British should have the most experience of everybody in modern warfare because they actually sent observers to watch the Americans fight, and they've discovered that machine guns are a thing. Infantry tactics, you no longer send people in blocks. artillery is a thing, barbed wire is a thing. They've observed the Japanese fight with the Russians. All of these things that supposedly caught everybody by surprise in 1914, they're already present. They're already fact. They just haven't been employed at scale. But because the British General Staff is run by, 80-year-old fuddy-duddies who are used to, fighting people with spears in Africa 30 years prior, they're like, oh, no, that none of this will ever be relevant. And so lack of imagination, right? Lack of observation, lack of putting things together.
Again, all right,
drones,
let's go ahead.
tactics, again, any similarities with present day are purely intentional.
It's also amazing because, you mentioned drones, but come on, the artillery, this has been there for ages.
Right.
They should have learned that before.
Right. But the kind of artillery that's used in like the early 1900s with the shells and everything versus the artillery that was used in the 1870s, which still used in some instances still used round shot. It's just there's a disconnect. And the range is completely different. Like this is the difference between like your original 1500s firearms and your early 1800s muskets. I don't even have to go that far. The muskets that were used at Waterloo and the muskets that were used at Gettysburg 50 years apart were like orders of magnitude different. You don't get away with an infantry charge at Gettysburg because the muskets will shred you at a kilometer's distance, which the Confederates found out the hard way. So, the tactics have to adapt, but they didn't. And so we get to 1908 and we got the Austrians in the annexation crisis, and the Serbs are really cheesed off about this. And they decide to turn elsewhere and basically, instead of going west, go south. And they make a deal with the Bulgarians and the Romanians and the Greeks and the Montenegrins, cousin family. And they, under the patronage of the Russians, and they get this Balkans Entente that challenges the Ottoman Empire in 1912, right after the Italians sort of destroyed them in Libya. This is when the Italians take over Libya and a whole bunch of islands in the Mediterranean and sort of, try recreating the Roman Empire long before Mussolini. And the Ottomans, having already lost an army in Libya, they're weak. And this is when the Balkans alliance strikes. And in 1912, they declare war for liberation of their remaining compatriots. And purely by accident, the Serbian army stumbles into the main Ottoman body near Skopje, north of Skopje in present-day North Macedonia at a place called Kumanovo, and takes on battle and just obliterates them, which basically ends the war. I mean, there's fighting for months on end, but by the time the Bulgarians take Edirne with siege artillery, the war's over, and the Ottomans lost. At which point the Austrians slide in, again with the help of the British, and go, oh, no, you can't do that. We must protect the Ottoman Empire at all costs. And they threaten to fight a war with Serbia. And the consequence of this is the creation of the state of Albania, which basically shifts all of the territorial agreements that the Balkans allies have made eastward at the expense of Bulgaria, which is really unhappy about this because they really wanted all of present-day North Macedonia for themselves. And the Austrians persuade the Bulgarians that they've been slighted, which they have been by the Austrians, to break off the alliance and basically launch a sneak attack at the Serbs in early 1913. And then everybody gangs up on the Bulgarians because they broke the alliance. And in late 1913, Bulgarians signed a peace. They've surrendered. They're done. And there's new borders in the Balkans, and Serbia's relatively happy. The Greeks are super happy. The Romanians are chuffed. The Montenegrins are very, very happy. They finally closed up that gap that the Austrians were keeping open, and they're all set to start. The Serbs have achieved their sacred mission that was set 500 years ago to liberate Kosovo, which was under Ottoman rule and no longer. Super happy about this. Everybody's happy as a clam except Austria. They're not happy at all because here they've got all these pocket states that they were trying to keep weak so they could conquer them. They've all of a sudden defeated the Turks. The Turks are irrelevant. They don't have a pretext to get involved in the Balkans anymore. The Russians have backed these people. They're getting stronger. They need to do something. Something needs to be done. And they have a bit of a crisis in Vienna because the old Emperor Franz Joseph is getting really old. He's basically overseen the collapse of the Habsburgs. His elder son Rudolf, at this point, I believe, has already committed suicide. He had, there was an issue. I don't remember the details. There was a couple of movies romanticizing this. He was married to a maid who was beneath his station or something. The preferred heir has committed suicide. The leftover heir, Franz Ferdinand, he's not very popular. He's a bit of an esoteric character. He's also married a Hungarian petty noble, Sophia Hotek, who cannot become empress by the rules. So she would have to be like a consort, something. The Habsburgs, it's a very ancient system, and they don't like her. But
yeah, because just to picture the idea, the rules, so that there was the Austrian and the Hungarian, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire that we call today. It was actually one empire, but it was split in two.
Right, by the deal from 1867, the Hungarians who used to be under the Habsburg crown for centuries after the Turks killed their entire royal dynasty at Mohacs, they were like, well, we've got to, we're basically a majority, we want our own self-rule. So they stayed under personal rule of the of the Austrian emperor, but they had their own kingdom. And they had their own parliament, their capital in Budapest, prime ministers, and so on. And so the Hungarians are not eager to fight at all. It's the Austrians who want to start something. And you've got this war faction in Vienna that literally wants to start something and defeat the Serbs before they become too strong. Ferdinand, ironically, is against this. And he has this clever plan to do this through diplomacy. He wants to create like a Slavic, principality within the empire that would take territories from both Hungarians and the Austrians. That would be closer to Vienna, so like have the Czechs on his side, sort of like the key influence because they're loyal, and essentially win them over to Catholic faith through diplomacy because the Czechs and the Slovaks are already Catholics. And so pull them in by diplomacy rather than war. And he's not too friendly with the Germans. There's a whole bunch of considerations. David Fromkin had a fantastic book that I always promote to no end called Europe's Last Summer, that basically described the thinking in Germany and the thinking in Austria. Because it was sort of a response to revisionists who were like, well, the British really screwed up. Like Neil Ferguson wrote The Pity of War, which was basically Britain should have never gotten involved. We still had our empire. Yeah, sure. Okay, yes. I mean, the point stands. He has a point. I'm not sure that, things wouldn't have worked out differently later. But yes, Britain absolutely got involved on a pretext. Belgium was a pretext. Everybody knew that the British had an option to stay out, but they chose not to because their policy was to always prevent the rise of a continental hegemony, which is in this case was the Germans. So, essentially Fromkin's thesis, which I'm going to sketch here, is that the Germans wanted Austria to keep the Russians busy while they defeated France, because their war plan called for defeat of France in basically a rerun of 1871. They wanted to defeat France quickly and then shift all of their armies to Russia because Russia was their principal enemy. Meanwhile, the Austrians were under the impression that the Germans are going to defend them from the Russians while they finish off Serbia. So you've got both Vienna and Berlin thinking past each other, but wanting to fight a war against the Russians, because both of them are aware that the big fight is going to be against Russia. But the Austrians want to finish off Serbs first, whereas the Germans want the Austrians to block the Russians first while they focus on the French, and they couldn't care less about Serbia. Anyway, there's this basically, not really counterfactual, but there's plenty of motivation, means, motive, and opportunity for the Austrian court, Konrad von Hetzendorf and what's their prime minister? I'm blanking out. Anyway, to get rid of Franz Ferdinand. they need him gone because he's blocking their plans for a war. He's standing between them, and they have this obsession about fighting Serbia now, because if they wait, Serbia is going to get stronger. They're going to get weaker. The Russians are going to get stronger. We need to get this done. And so in 1914, after the Balkans Wars, they judge Serbia's weak. It needs time to recover. Russia's weak. It needs time to recover. Now is the time to strike. The Thucydides trap, right? You need to strike before your enemy gets too strong. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because then the enemy, realizing that you're trying to strike him, starts getting stronger, and then war becomes inevitable. So the Germans adopt this hard line. The Austrians adopt this hard line with the Albanian crisis towards Serbia. And in June of 1914, on the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, which is June 28th, they send Franz Ferdinand to oversee military exercises outside Sarajevo, Sarajevo being the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, administrative capital. And this is a provocation if ever there was one, because again, June 28th is the date of the original Battle of Kosovo from 1389 that the Serbs have celebrated in folk poetry as their covenant with Christ. It's one of those, there's a handful of people around the world who think of themselves in covenant terms, like their covenant with God. The Serbs are one of them. Whether it's realistic or not, it's one of those where perceptions matter. And so 1389 for Serbs is a time when they lost the earthly kingdom, but gained the kingdom of heaven, and essentially sacrificed their entire army, but by the way, also killed the Turkish Sultan. And so the Turks didn't come back for 70 years. And so here's Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg throne, coming to Sarajevo, provoking the Serbs with these massive military exercises, rattling the saber on their sacred holiday, which is symbolized by the Serbian knight going into the den of the enemy and slaying the enemy leader. And here's this impoverished Serb student from Grahovo, which is in Western Herzegovina, which is a very, very, think Scotland, but with lots more rocks. And he's already sickly from malnourishment and poverty. He's studying Lord knows what, I don't remember. I should. And he's basically high on this romantic feeling of, something's in the air, liberation is coming, we've avenged Kosovo, we need to fight for the freedom of our people. The Serbs in Bosnia are very, very upset because the Austrians are routinely oppressing them. They've in 1911, they had this whole treason process where they basically rounded up a bunch of Serbian publishers and accused them of treason for daring to, speak Serbian and write in Cyrillic. If you think lawfare is a new invention, it isn't. It's been used for centuries. And so they're already primed to rebel. They've already been upset since the annexation crisis. And so Ferdinand is coming to Sarajevo. It's like, oh, come on. They're daring us to do something. Well, unfortunately for Ferdinand, the students have basically gotten in contact with the Serbian branch of the Serbian Secret Service that was acting unofficially and unbeknownst to the government. Colonel Apis and his Black Hand organization are sort of a power unto themselves. And they gave him some old guns and some grenades and like, hey, kids, whatever, just keep us out of it. And you've got these, 17, 18-year-olds basically deciding they'll be big damn superheroes in their own story. And they set up this ambush along the river as Ferdinand's motorcade is supposed to drive to this fake Moorish building that's the town hall. And one of these guys throws a grenade that is so old and so poorly maintained that it fails to detonate. And he may have thrown it too early. Who knows? Bomb goes off, doesn't injure Ferdinand, but blows up the car after him, injures a bunch of people. The police obviously catches the guy. Everybody else gets cold feet and leaves. And Ferdinand is pissed. He's like, well, they've tried to attack me. They've injured my men. I must see to them. And so after his meeting at the town hall, he tells the driver to drive to the military hospital. And he literally makes the wrong turn.
Into your street.
Into my street, the street that I grew up. he makes a wrong turn. Ferdinand yells at him, "What are you doing?" It's an old car, so he stops the car, stalls, doesn't press the clutch properly. The car just sits there. And Princip, who had ducked into a shop, because it was like, well, there goes our chance. We failed. He went to get a cup of coffee and a pastry. He sees Ferdinand, and he's like, well, that's my moment. Pulls out his pistol, fires. He's a lousy shot. He never had a chance to practice. They don't have enough bullets. So he just basically, he doesn't quite do it a side hold, but, he's a terrible shot. And so he aims for Ferdinand. Right.
It's 1900 tissue. It's a revolver.
Yeah. Think GTA Sarajevo, right? So
I'm sorry.
So he shoots, aims at Ferdinand, hits him, aims at General Potiorek, who's the military governor, who's hated, and they want him dead more than Ferdinand himself, misses, and accidentally hits Sophia, who's trying to shield Ferdinand with her body. And so he basically kills both of them. They die very quickly. They don't live for more than a couple of hours. They're taken to a hospital. There's nothing to be done. Potiorek escapes unscathed. Of course, Princip is immediately caught, beaten to within an inch of his life, and thrown into a dungeon. And this German attorney, who was literally, who came to Sarajevo to start his practice because that was the colonies and you could make a fortune, is assigned to be their public defender. And he actually makes a very coherent case that none of these people could possibly be traitors because Bosnia was illegally annexed. It's not actually under Austrian law, subject to Austrian rule. They did nothing wrong. And the man just lays out this legendary court defense, and the judges say, yeah, all of this is true, doesn't matter, they're going to hang. Because somebody has to. Let's
say they were considered terrorists.
Right. Well, they basically declared them traitors. That's the thing. They charged them as traitors. Now, if the Austrians were so as legalistic as some other Western countries, Tisler's argument would have succeeded. But no, they needed to hang. And so they execute most of them. Princip, however, because when he was technically a minor under Austrian law, when he committed this, he is basically sentenced to life in prison. And he's sent to this fortress in Czechia called Theresienstadt, which might be more familiar to people as the Terezin Ghetto. 20 years later, the Nazis used this as the fake propaganda ghetto where they basically assemble Eastern European Jews before they ship them off to Auschwitz, and pretend that this is the paradise ghetto, that the Germans are taking care of the Jews. And it's some places are really cursed. But when I visited that place many years ago, as part of a tour, they obviously took us to the ghetto itself, and a handful of us from this area were like, can we see the fortress? And they took us to the fortress and showed us the SS torture chambers and everything. And then somebody who realized who we were and why we were there said, let us show you the cell. And they showed us the cell where Princip was held. And basically it's a dungeon. And they kept him there. They fed him very little. They beat him. He ended up having to, one of his arms had to be amputated. He died of tuberculosis. They told him that Serbia had perished, falsely. And he died before the war ended, and he never saw Serbia liberated. So they sort of think of what was being done to Julian Assange up until a couple of days ago, only in much faster process. Yeah, exactly. And so Princip dies in a Czech dungeon, but his ghost sort of has the last laugh because Potiorek, the man he missed, ends up leading the Austrian campaign in 1914 and leading it so disastrously that he ends up losing not one but two major battles in succession within 6 months. There was a big offensive in July that predated the Guns of August, so the war kicks off. And I'm sort of getting into the weeds now. Let me just quickly get back. But I just wanted to mention Potiorek. So he commands two Austrian offensives into Serbia, and he gets catastrophically defeated both times to the point where his troops are drowning, swimming across the river back, and surrendering by the tens of thousands. And he had absolute dominion in men, material, ammunition, everything. But he was an idiot. And he basically wasted his opportunity. All right, so let me just,
okay.
Yeah. But so after the assassination, the Germans pressed the Austrians to declare war on Serbia quickly, move quickly, destroy Serbia quickly, and then if the Russians decide to get involved, war it is. The Austrians dawdle. They cannot make up their mind. They take a month to formulate an ultimatum to Serbia designed to be rejected. It is almost entirely accepted, except for sending Austrian police to investigate in Serbia proper, because that's a breach of sovereignty. You can't have that. And Serbia basically says, sends a messenger to Russia and goes, they're going to attack us. This is it. This is war. We're not prepared. Help us, please. And Nicholas II goes, well, I owe you one for 1908. So I guess even though we're not prepared, we're going to fight with you. And that triggers the terms of the alliance with the French. The French are eager to fight themselves. They want war because they want vengeance for 1871. They want to recapture those two provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, the Germans. So they want vengeance for that, and their entire doctrine is attack. The German war plan is to attack the French. And they're pretty inflexible because it's industrial warfare. All of their logistics, all their mobilization schedules, all their train schedules, it's all to fight the French. So they set that in motion. The Austrians set this in motion. The Russians set theirs in motion. And the British decide, well, we might as well join the party as well. And so they send an expeditionary force to Belgium. And the rest, as they say, is history, because it's what starts as a dispute over an archduke. What was that great line from Blackadder? I heard that some bloke named Archduke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
Blackadder. That's what's
I mean, and next thing you know, tens of millions of people are dead. Austria-Hungary has broken up into its component parts, including parts of present-day Ukraine, and Hungary's been reduced to much less than its ethnic heartland. Because the Russian Empire had collapsed into Bolshevism, Serbia lost a major ally, so the heir to the Serbian king who took over had to improvise alliances with the Czechs and the French and sort of westernize things and create this Yugoslavia that he believed was going to be a counterweight to any sort of chance of Austria rising again by sheer mass. It wasn't Austria he had to worry about. It was Germany. The French basically bled out and refused to fight after 1917. The British bled out and couldn't fight past 1918. And then the Americans had to be brought in as cannon fodder to finish the job, which Woodrow Wilson eagerly did because he wanted to rule the world. And then he had a stroke. So he couldn't put his grand plan into effect. And his chief advisor, Colonel House, who had these dystopian fantasies of a future technocratic state and wrote a novel about it under a pseudonym, he basically arranged the Versailles Agreement. And all of this stuff basically set the stage for World War II because nothing really got resolved. And then you had, vindictive people like Hitler who survived the trenches and wanted a rematch. You had the French being so traumatized by the war that they basically folded within 6 weeks when the Germans attacked in 1940 because they were winning impossibly quickly and they lost their nerve. You had you had Serbian officers from World War I who successfully fought the Balkans campaign that I again neglected to mention. It's a subject for its own show. But you had people who survived the two battles with the Austrians, and then the German invasion of 1915, and then a retreat through Albania and Greece, and then the advance through Greece, through the mountains to present-day Macedonia that just rolled up, knocked Bulgaria out of the war, rolled up the Germans, basically broke Austria-Hungary, and essentially ended the war on the Southern Front when the Western Front was still a stalemate. These people in 1940 were like, oh no, the Germans are going to conquer the world. We must preemptively surrender. This is the level of psychosis because they've seen the trench warfare and they did not believe themselves anymore. And so this was the trauma of World War I that made World War II possible. And people who start their histories in 39 or 41 are missing the big picture. Because again, and this is a Western bias, because the British don't like to talk about World War I because they made a bunch of stupid decisions, and there was no self-promoter like Winston Churchill. In fact, he doesn't like to talk about World War I because his operation in Gallipoli ended up in complete and abject failure, and he had to resign as the first Lord of the Admiralty because of it, if I remember correctly. But Churchill is the prime minister in World War II, and he writes the history books in which he's the big damn hero. So World War II is popular in Western historiography and iconography because of these books and because of this narrative. World War I sort of gets neglected. Yeah. Because it's not black and white. They can't spin it like this. Even though for Serbs, it was black and white, absolutely. We got invaded, we fought back. But, you don't see Spielberg making epic movies about Serbia in World War I because it doesn't serve the imperial narrative. Whereas, filming a mostly historical epic about Normandy does. And, you get to show it at the anniversary of the D-Day landings and claim that this is how it really was.
This is how we want.
But it's the thing that still baffles me. You can make a historical movie, but it's a narrative that's in the service of something else. Basically, replacing history with movies is how the West ended up getting, and I'm going to use the R word here, ended up retarded when it comes to history, because they think they know what happened, but what they saw isn't what happened. But because movies are so realistic, people tend to appropriate them as memories. And so they think what they've seen on the screen is what happened in real life, or what they've seen in pictures, because we're visual creatures. And it's just not true. Like, even if that particular narrative about Saving Private Ryan, and it was romanticized, is more or less accurate as to the events of the actual, invasion, it doesn't mean that's what decided the war, because it didn't. But again, you don't really see very many. You see, 1917 was made recently as a sort of British story of World War I, but it's sort of pointlessness because, yeah, sure, it was technically superb with that one shot, consistently in one take, but that's not where the war was decided. Neither All Quiet on the Western Front, nor 1917, nor The Lost Battalion, or any of these movies set in the West actually tell the story of what won the war. Because to do that, you'd have to get out of your Western narrative, out of your comfort zone, and bring up people that are historically neglected because they don't fit. They don't fit the narrative of Western imperial power and the inevitability of the right side of history, or whatever they want to say. The Western Marxist dialectic, so to speak. And so that's really the issue with World War I, why it's so undercovered.
Yeah, just like as you mentioned, the Saving Private Ryan, there's also the day that the D-Day where the Americans saved Benini from Auschwitz. Well, some people say that that's not Auschwitz. That can be any concentration camp, whatever. But which, by the way, that movie won an Oscar against a Brazilian fantastic movie called Central do Brasil. If you haven't watched it, watch it. It's it's a cult movie. It's a very interesting, good movie, and it's better giving the golden statue to the guy that said that Americans saved World War II, to the Italian dude that saved World War II. We have just. The time flew. Actually, it's 3:09 already. I think we have covered World War I, and we were talking before. I think 1 hour is not. We are going to briefly, scratch through World War II, and that's. But I think we got so people that watch this video, comment here. What are the similarities between the period just before the prelude to World War I and what we are seeing now in the present days? So do you think there's a very important consideration to so we can wrap up this first video of this series that we are going to try to make in the next weeks or so? I
think the big takeaway is that great powers in both world wars, Western powers, horrifically underestimated the Russians. Even though, and a whole separate show could be done about what happened on the Eastern Front, but the Germans got lucky. Essentially, that's the short story. The Germans got extremely lucky because they acted through subterfuge. They sent Lenin within a sealed train back into Russia, and he fomented a revolution that ultimately knocked Russia out of the war. And the Germans were really pleased about that up until 20 years later, it boomeranged on them when they realized that communism was ended up working far better to industrialize Russia and turn it into their worst nightmare. What they were trying to prevent by World War I is what ended up happening prior to World War II. And they ended up doing one more roll of the dice with Hitler's Operation Barbarossa. And according to one of my favorite military strategists these days, Big Serge, he made a very conclusive case in his mega thread that Barbarossa was doomed to fail when it began, because they simply did not have the force generation, the logistics. They could not achieve this. Napoleon reached Moscow but couldn't hold it because the objective was the Russian military. The Germans shredded the Russian military, but couldn't hold Moscow, couldn't take it out, basically ran out of steam. And it's a miracle they got as far as they did. And their defeat at that point was completely inevitable. It was just a question of when and how bad it was going to be. And just as the Russians ended up in Paris in 1814, they ended up in Berlin in 1945. And now the West has poked the Russian bear again. And I'm not saying they're going to end up in Lisbon or London, but nothing would surprise me at this point. Give it a couple of years. Because, if you ask somebody in like April 1917 how long this war is going to go for, people would say 30 years because nothing happens. And then, a year and a half later, the entire world as they knew it was over. You ask somebody in 44, right before the Allies landed in Normandy and before the Soviets crushed Army Group Center in Operation Bagration, this could go on for a few years. It's still a toss-up. We could still win this thing. 6 months later, it was common knowledge that this is going to end. It was just a matter of details. So once these things pass a certain point, gradually and then suddenly, was it Hemingway described how people go poor. It's exactly how wars end. It's essentially a slugfest, and then once the breaking point is reached, everything goes downhill very, very quickly. I'm not saying we're there yet. We could be. We don't see it yet. We don't have enough information. But once the breaking point comes and you start seeing the cascade, you will be able to spot that we're in that stage where things are happening, especially in talking about the Ukrainian battlefield right now. But again, as I've said this many times before, Ukraine is just one kinetic battlefield in a larger conflict, which is happening through sanctions, through diplomacy, everywhere else in the world, through these coups and spyfare and all these things. This is, we basically are in World War III already. It's not gone fully kinetic because that would mean nuclear annihilation. Nobody really wants that. At least I hope nobody really wants that.
Reasonable people don't want that.
Yeah. So, but again, like if there's any lesson, is that World War I started because people who were supposed to be smart ended up being very stupid. And this war started because people who we thought were very smart ended up being very stupid. And now it's time to pay the piper. And it's just the only thing we really don't know is the shape of the world afterwards. I think at this point, I'm pretty confident in who's going to win this thing. I think it's fairly obvious. But
I think by February 22, I think we knew who were going to win. Well, at least we knew who were going to lose, but we just don't know yet how it's going to develop. That's one thing that I always say. We still don't know how it's going to develop, how it's going to end. Well, more than one people can lose.
Yeah, and that's really the thing we should be focusing on, and I think some people in power are focusing on is on the shape of the world to come. Because the world we grew up in no longer exists.
Yeah, this is one thing that I just commented today about the Bolivian coup, the attempt coup. I think that the people that we should consider smart and we think they're dumb, they are not that dumb, and they have already seen all that you just said, and we are no longer in pre-conflict or during conflict, or we are already on the sharing of the cake.
Yeah.
That's what we see in South America.
Yeah, I think we're definitely in that stage already. Thanks for having me once again. It's always a pleasure. I do have to run, though.
Exactly, yes. And I just had a thing from TikTok, which, by the way, now we are also on TikTok. Neboja, thank you very much for your time and again for coming. And let's try to arrange the next for World War II so we can understand what's happening now by looking at the past and comparing a little bit of the present. It's always a pleasure. Remember all the social media, and I'm going to add that I didn't know Neboja has a YouTube channel. He's going to send me, and I'm going to add on the description. Remember to like, share, subscribe, all the drills from social media. You know, we need that. And yeah, see you guys on the next time. And who wants to give a super chat or a super like? Thank you very much. See you, Neboja. Thank you very much. See you next time. See you guys.